You can continue being freeloader. Just please don't yell on Twitter or whatever, oh, I shouldn't be using open source. Because that's the case. You shouldn't. You shouldn't. You specifically shouldn't.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 264, Navigating the Changing Landscape of Open Source. This episode of DevOps Paradox is brought to you by Barbaro Moho. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darin and Viktor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darin reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Viktor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darin Pope and Viktor Farsic. Over the past 6-8 months, there have been lots of changes in the software industry when it comes to what we believed was open source. Do you think the definition of open source has changed at all?
It did somehow change because the adoption of open source changed drastically. And that means that the demand for open source changed drastically. And that means that the effort that needs to be put into open source changed drastically, right? If I go back, 20 years, maybe more, right? Open source were pet projects in a way, with very few exceptions. I did not have high expectations from them. And they could be managed by a single person, right? A person that's my Saturday afternoon fun. And we did not rely that much on open source as business, right? So it was more like, okay, pet projects for pet projects. That's probably longer than 20 years ago, but in the past. Now it's the world, and this is, I believe, important for this conversation. The world depends on open source. We're not talking about pet projects anymore.
Not only does the world depend on open source, and I want to go ahead and let's group in public domain software the same as well, because I'm thinking SQLite, because it's not open source, but it is public domain. It affects the universe, because SQLite's on satellites.
Yeah.
There was a time where the only way you could have software in a business is, think about this for just a second, you actually had to pay for the software. You had to go to IBM, Microsoft, or go to a vendor like CDW and buy software.
Correct. And today we are at the other extreme that I dare you to find me closed source software that you can buy that is not built on top of open source.
Or at least has some open source components.
Exception might be Windows ecosystem. I'm not that familiar with it because Windows itself is probably fully closed source unless it changed. I guess it is, no? But the fact that if you're running Linux, there you go. That alone is already means that you rely on open source, no matter what you built on top of it, no matter how somebody sells it to you as closed source.
There was a time in the before times of Linux where there was SCO Unix and other Unix variants, VMS. You had to buy it. And how can I say it nicely? It was not cheap. It was very expensive. Very expensive. Because people needed to be paid to create that software. And the companies that employed those people needed to make a profit.
Here's a question for you, Darin. Tell me a decently sized open source project that doesn't have fully employed maintainers.
Decently sized.
So, not a library, NPM library, yes, but I'm talking about decently sized, like Kubernetes, right? Linux, anything bigger.
Yeah, but Kubernetes doesn't have somebody paying them to actually work on it.
Apart from dozens of people, maybe even hundreds, no. If you exclude all those dozens or hundreds of people who are paid to work on it full time, the rest is hobbyist.
I'm glad you actually brought up Kubernetes because this is what I wanted to talk about. There is not one single quote unquote owner of Kubernetes.
Mm-hmm.
Let's leave the CNCF out of this for just a moment. They own the license, for lack of a better term. Would you agree with that? That CNCF
is the owner.
Is the owner, right? But CNCF doesn't pay anybody to develop Kubernetes.
Nope.
Not a dime.
Yet there are people paid to work on it.
So there are people that are paid to work on Kubernetes from the big three, AWS, GCP, Azure, right?
And dozens of small companies. So what I mean by paid, okay, maybe actually I defined it wrongly before. Doesn't have to be full-time. But any person that contributes to Kubernetes during office hours is being paid to work on it, right? Can that pass as a definition of being paid? You might not be being paid directly, kind of like in your check that you receive weekly or monthly, kind of because you worked on Kubernetes. But your company says, yeah, you can work on it during company hours, office hours. That means you're paid to work on it, right?
I think it is. But let's magic hand wave and let's go back to the 80s. Would that have happened in the 80s? Even the early 90s?
No, because companies did not, with a few exceptions, companies did not see what is the interest that they have to pay you to work on open source. They had no interest in it, no benefit in paying you to do that. So you could still work on it, but outside office hours. So weekends, nights.
But in those nights and weekends, you could have done it, but there was no value to the company. That's the reason why they wouldn't let you work on it.
Exactly. And that's in case of companies that did not actually ask you to sign a contract that prevents you from working even in your free hours on anything outside company, right? Some companies do that, quite a few actually. Many people do not read the contracts in details, but you're not actually allowed to work while you're employed by that company or something outside.
Anything, by the way, in some contracts.
Or to put it the other way around, you're allowed to work on other things, but then that company owns that something. And then you need to explain how that company can own open source project that was not even started by you. And if it was started by you, then you're in deep trouble because that's not yours.
Let me go ahead and put the disclaimer in. We are not lawyers. We are definitely not global lawyers. Talk to your lawyer if you need to get clarification on how you're employed. So if I'm able to work on something, let's come back to 2024. If I'm able to work on an open source project because my employer is paying me, there is a strong probability that they are getting value from whatever that open source project is that I am contributing to.
Correct. And that needs to sink in. That's a reality that people ignore. When we have discussions in public about different open source projects doing this and that, that is often overlooked detail.
Can I say it this way? Follow the money? Is that one way to think about it?
And there is nothing inherently wrong with it. There are many wrong cases, but there's nothing wrong in me being able to pay my daughter's education while working. I need money. Let me make it clear. I might not need millions, but I need money to live. Otherwise, I cannot do things. If you want people working full-time on an open source project, you need to pay them somehow.
Let me flip that around. That's talking about a company that's getting value from it directly. I'm going to, again, use Kubernetes, AWS, GCP, Azure. They all have hosted Kubernetes solutions. It makes 1,000% sense to do that. Let's flip this around. I am company X and I'm using Kubernetes, but I don't want to use any of the offerings from the big three. I find problems, I open up issues, and I expect everybody to have those issues fixed for me by the end of the day. No questions asked. Why isn't it done yet? I tell you what, I am using this project. I expect you to fix this thing that I'm using that I'm not paying anybody for at all.
Exactly.
I need to go check my blood pressure again.
Yeah, and then you need to wake up.
Well, unfortunately, that is not too far off from what I've seen in quite a few Reddit groups and a few other Discord groups that I've been watching recently. Is people say, hey, look, I know I'm not paying you anything, but I expect this to be fixed because my stuff is broken. And because you did an upgrade and you did an improvement to whatever this thing was and it broke how my thing was working, it's your fault. You need to fix it because my stuff is no longer working. And the reason why it got fixed is because it was a bug. And you were taking advantage of a bug to do your work. It's your problem, not the maintainers.
Now, you will find young maintainers fulfilling all the requests that they can from people, but then they get burned after a year or something like that, right? Because you're young, you're full of enthusiasm, you decided not to sleep. It happens. It's not it doesn't happen. It doesn't last long. Actually, what was it? This morning, I think, I was looking now for that post. I actually read on Twitter a post from Stefan Prodan. That's the person behind Flux, amazing engineer, that says, having a project in an open source foundation with big orgs as adopters and a constant stream of contributions does not guarantee the project's survival, just short-term success. If you cannot find a way to pay full-time maintainers, all will crumble as people get burned out.
I think we could end the episode right there. We're not going to. But if you can't pay them, or if you're unwilling to pay them, and if people using the software are unwilling to pay somebody to maintain it, then that it is not a real thing. It's dead on arrival. Do you agree with that?
100%.
So we have a problem. Hello, my name is Darin. I have a problem. So we have some companies that are willing to invest into a project because they're getting value from it. And more than likely, if they've put a lot of time and effort into working in a project, they're going to get their things in first. Makes sense?
Exactly.
If you're a consumer of said project and you don't contribute anything, all you do is send nastygrams and are just being an overall jerk, then why are you using the project anyway? Seems like you need to, go to Hawaii and have a vacation.
Because it's free.
This is the problem. Nothing is free. If Google would have not started the Kubernetes project, if they would have never open sourced it, we would not be having this conversation about Kubernetes right now. We'd still be talking about Mesos.
They had interest to open source it, and they did it. Whether that interest paid off or not, that's a separate conversation, right? But at least planned interest to open source it. They open source it, and then others saw interest in it, and they jumped on a train and started contributing, putting real money. And when I say real money, I don't mean money in terms of dollars, but of engineering time into the project. And that's how we got Kubernetes as it is today, right? Now, some people don't have interest. Some companies will allow people to work on projects during office hours because of other interest, not necessarily financial. It could be, you know what, if I don't let this person dedicate Friday on Kubernetes, and I'm using it as example, he's going to leave. That's the only way how to retain that person, right? It could be that as well, but that's also some kind of interest, right?
What do you say to people, and that's actually a good example, but what do you say to companies that are, actually, let me restate what you're talking about there. You're giving a person a chance on Fridays just to do work. I'm able to retain them. It's not costing me any extra money. Yes, it's costing me 8 hours of salary. But if I look at that, 8 hours of salary over 50 weeks a year, so that's 400 hours. Okay, maybe that's $40,000 in top line salary. But if they're happy and they're sticking around, those other 4 days of the week, they're going to be a lot more excited about staying on and doing because they know Friday's coming. And I get to do this on Friday.
And look, that's such a low price to pay because, look, you have managers and directors and what's not that are being paid 10 times more than that brilliant engineer. He's not really asking you for a lot of money. He's asking you for a bit of time to contribute to a project. I think that's actually a very good deal. So instead of paying him $500,000 a year, I'm paying him $100K a year, and he's asking me for a Friday to work on Kubernetes. It's such a good deal.
Because you're not having to retrain people. Plus, if you're using Kubernetes internally anyway, and you've got a core maintainer on your team, guess what? You're now at the table with AWS, GCP, Azure. You can't buy that kind of influence. Now, let me ask you this question. What do you say to multi-billion-dollar companies? I'm just going all the way in now. Not even multi-million, multi-billion-dollar companies that keep on leeching off of open source projects and are unwilling to pay anything, not even contribute $10 a month. What do you have to say to them?
I'm not sure how many of those we have. I would guess not many. But just to clarify the category we're talking about, I'm guessing that when you say contributing, you mean neither contributing in code nor contributing by paying some other company support or license or something like that, right? You're talking about companies that are not paying in any form.
Let me state it more clearly. They are freeloaders.
I think that eventually they pay most of those eventually pay. They always end up having a very expensive deal with Red Hat or AWS or Microsoft or somebody, right? They do pay for it, just not directly.
Suspend reality for a moment for yourself. What would you say to that multi-billion-dollar company that is doing nothing but freeloading and complaining that their stuff isn't being fixed?
Shut the F up. Complaining. I mean, look, open source is free. I cannot say anything wrong. I think it's wrong, but I cannot complain. Yeah, I cannot complain to people using it. It's free. It's available. You're not forced to contribute. You're not forced to pay. It's optional, right? So I cannot say anything to people just using open source and not giving anything back. I think it's wrong. I think it's terribly wrong, but hey, that's okay. But if you start complaining, then my answer is shut the F up. In that specific category. It's not everybody. People have the right to complain, but freeloaders have no right to complain, in my book.
That's a good way to think about it. Just as you are free to use it, the maintainers are free to tell you to no thank you. Or maintainers are free to tell you, here's how you can help contribute.
Exactly. Again, it's free to use and it's free to fork it. You don't even have to contribute back. You have a problem, fork it, solve it, and from there on, you're on your own.
We recently talked about how to upgrade Kubernetes. And one of the things that we talked about was people don't realize when they sign up for using Kubernetes that they're also signing up for having to upgrade Kubernetes on a 4 to 8 month cycle just to stay within a maintainable scenario.
4 months, not 8, because you shouldn't be jumping.
That's true.
You can do every two upgrades every 8 months, but it ends up the same.
Right. If all you're doing is taking from open source and not contributing, whether that's you're contributing people back to help, contributing money to the project or the foundation potentially, or just paying a company for support, and you're just being a freeloader, it's fine to freeload. I'll put it that way. It's fine to freeload. Please, freeload all you want. But when you make demands while being a freeloader, that's a problem.
Exactly. You need to earn that right to complain.
Right. But that takes us back over to the Kubernetes example we were saying. It's like, okay, we got this engineer. His Fridays are working on Kubernetes. But because he's done that and people have seen him within the CNCF, it's like, oh, wait, this guy is actually now a core maintainer. And if there's things that we would like to get done, we actually have influence. We're a small company, but we're at the table with all the bigs. That can be a big deal for the company, not necessarily the guy. The guy might just be happy. It's like, just let me work on this. I just need to step away and, work on this on Fridays. That's it. So what's going to happen once we get rid of the freeloaders? I really need to get my blood pressure down. When we get rid of the freeloaders and we have people that are contributing, and contributing again can mean money, time, people. There's probably other ways to contribute as well. I'm going to throw it loosely around marketing. You're talking about the projects that you use. Right? We could not run our business unless we were using X, Y, and Z. Now, you may not have the money to pay for support on those. You may not need support because you have a team already in-house that can maintain it. That's true for a lot of projects. Not Kubernetes, by the way, most of the time. Unless you're the Adobes of the world, I would say. So what do we say to people when they feel like, okay, how can I contribute? What is the right way to contribute? Or how can we break down this contribution? Things like, well, I can't do money. Well, what can they do?
It can be anything. It can be contributing code. That's the most obvious. You saw a typo in documentation. Fix that. Or you don't even need to touch the repos in any form of way. By the way, it's not always code, right? There are many things happening in repos. You can be answering questions on Slack, of that project Slack, right? You can be helping people verbally. There are many ways how you can be part of that community, right? It doesn't have to be, it sounds scary, kind of, I need to contribute code. You don't. There are many ways to contribute. I would probably define contributions like you benefit from using that project and then you put something back in terms of investing a bit of your time to give something back. And that can be anything. It can be just hanging out in Slack, helping people, answering questions.
Because if the engineers are answering questions, they're not coding. You can't have both ways there.
The easiest is simply, Slack is probably always or Discord, depending on what the project is using, the best starting point. That's where people are gathering. That's where things are happening. And if you're just there, almost everybody figures out how they can help, right? Over time, not necessarily first day, but over time, you just hang out with the crowd and you'll figure it out.
Now, one of the ways you can help us is to listen to this message from today's sponsor. Meet Barbaro Mojo, the delicious Cuban hot sauce with a kick that's sponsoring today's episode. Barbaro Mojo brings the heat with their unique Cuban marinade base, adding an unforgettable flavor to your favorite dishes. With flavors like El Habanero, Haribo, Bonazzo, and Best Day Ever, there's a perfect match for everyone's taste buds. As a DevOps Paradox listener, you're entitled to an exclusive 25% discount on your first order. Just visit barbaromojo.com and use the promo code DevOps25, that's DevOps, the number 2, and the number 5, at checkout to claim your discount. Thanks to Barbaro Mojo for sponsoring today's episode. Now, there have been some scenarios with some vendors that have done some things that have gotten the community up in arms. Let's put it that way. We're not going to name names. One of the scenarios was a project used to be put out with an LTS. And now the company that's sort of sitting behind that has decided no more LTSs unless you're going to pay for them. You only get whatever's built. Think of it as a weekly or a daily or whatever the cadence is. It doesn't really matter. This is actually not a new thing. And it's actually very normal.
It's very, very common. Very common. I wouldn't be surprised if we would pull some stats that probably that's support. Support is probably the first business that companies establish on top of open source, right? For support to work, you need in a way to force, for support to be effective, you need to insist that your customers, those who do pay support, use your releases, stable releases, because you cannot deal with randomly daily release, right? It's very, very hard to give support for something like that. You need what we call stable releases, right? Releases that are less frequent and that have been verified by those same people who are giving you support. It's a very, very common thing. I saw that news without naming the company, and I was very surprised that everybody freaked out. I see it as a common and a normal first step in a company behind the open source project to earn some money so that they can actually continue paying people to contribute to the project. It would be bad if that announcement was from today, there are no more open source releases of this stuff. That would be bad. But releases are continuing. Just the stable releases, validated by people being paid to do that, are now commercial ones. I see nothing wrong with that. You can still get whatever is the cadence of the releases in that project for free. You're still getting a great deal.
You just don't get and we don't know the full scenario of their testing, but I would have to assume that if it is a daily release, let's use weekly in case it's a weekly. Weekly releases are probably already fully automated. Nobody's even doing anything. It's Tuesday. And now today's release day for the week. But your long-term supports come out once every 4, 6, 8 weeks, whatever it is. And that level of testing on that LTS is probably a whole lot more stringent than what's happening on the weekly.
And guess what? The quality of those normal releases, not stable, still depends on the community. If you don't like the quality of those releases, get involved in testing them. But that hurts because then you're investing your time in doing something instead of complaining about something. Just to be clear, there are many other cases. I don't know whether we'll talk about it or not, and I think that projects do things that they shouldn't, but that's not the case. I have no problem with that one.
And again, like I said earlier, you're free to choose to use the project or not use the project. What you're not free to do is to use the project and complain. Well, actually, I guess you can complain, but you can't complain when you're a freeloader. I guess we're just sticking with freeloading today.
Yeah, you can physically complain. Even that is allowed. It's just that I will react to that complaint as the words that I shouldn't say aloud.
And I appreciate that since I'm editing this. So we talked about that one scenario. There was the other scenarios to where companies changed the licenses. That's not what this other scenario was. Again, people have to be paid. Period.
Yes, but changing licenses, I think that's in my head that sparks a different type of conversation that I believe we should be having, and that conversation is about the difference between something having open source license and that's it, and who owns that project, right? People are mistaking when thinking that the fact that you have MIT license, that means that, people own it. That's not true. Somebody owns the project, and that somebody is allowed to change the license anytime they want. And that brings me to the big difference in open source project being owned by a company and being owned by a foundation. And no foundation is perfect, but still there is a huge difference, right? It's not the same having Elastic open source, or was open source, owned by Elastic, and some other Kubernetes, also open source, by being owned by a foundation. I think that's a major difference, right? Due to those recent license changes, I hope that people are going to start making that distinction. It's not only whether it's open source, but you need to take a look at who owns it. Now, going back to the license change, I think it's ingenious a bit to say, you know what? Having open source license hurts us now, but without having open source license, we would never be where we are. Meaning that we would never become successful without being open source, but now that we are successful, let's change it to something else. That's a move that I hope will always be resolved with a fork.
I think that's the only answer that can happen in that scenario. Because what that tells me is if it doesn't fork,
there's little value to the community. The community being, people that aren't willing to pay cash.
If the fork fails, and very often it does, that's a sign, okay, so actually nobody wanted to put their money into this. Again, when I say money, I mean loosely coupled money. It could be time. And the fork died. Well, then, I think that we all deserve to not to have this as open source and pay for it, if that's what happens, right? And if the fork thrives, then it shows the opposite, kind of, okay, so you made a mistake by changing the license. You had the right to do it, but you made a mistake. And when a project is successful, then actually forks usually work because, and here's the tricky part, not because of community and people, but because some other companies see an opportunity in monetizing on the fork of the project that just got, with the company behind that project that just got backlash from the community. So kind of, you change the license, your business is going down because we are going to ignore you. Therefore, our business is going to some other companies who are going to actually invest in that fork. And eventually, that same companies might do the same thing in the future, but that's now we're entering into the loop, right? Probably the first example that I know of something similar happening, that's a project that both of us worked on. That's Hudson, right? Hudson is the oldest example I know of something similar happening, right? When it was acquired by Oracle and it eventually became Jenkins, for a good reason. And that fork, Jenkins is a fork. I think that's important, right? Nobody knows it as a fork today, but that's a fork of a project, Hudson. And that fork, on a long run, ended up being infinitely more successful than the original.
That's true. But again, I'm going to say follow the money. Because people have to be paid to work on software. This is not the early 2000s and late 90s to where, I'll put myself in this, not married, well, I was married then. But anyway, let's say you're not married, don't have kids, and you've got your weekends and nights free. But you get older, you begin relationships, you have kids, you have soccer games on the weekends, you got whatever else going on, and all of your time just seems to magically disappear. So even though you may have been a great maintainer, you alluded to this earlier, for years, now you've got zero time. You're now an emeritus. You can take a look at your GitHub commit history and all of a sudden all the greens are now all black. So how do we talk to companies that are not freeloaders? Well, they're freeloaders, but they're not actually being mean or anything else. How do we talk to them to say, hey, look, you're dependent on this open source project. You have said as much that you are completely dependent on it, this project. And if it was to go away, you don't know how it would impact your business. How do you talk to people like that to say, hey, look, you need to help or whatever? What would you say to them?
I think that what you just said is the right approach to it, right? I don't think that companies should, and individuals in companies should, or companies should invest money. Time is money as well, because they're nice, right? Because of the goodness of their hearts, right? The question is, the statement is actually that you should be investing in open source because it is in your interest to do so. And there can be many reasons why it's your interest, right? Again, either by your workers contributing or by you paying some third-party company, doesn't matter. It's in your interest. If it happens that you have zero interest in it, don't. But then, obviously, if you start complaining, then obviously you had some interest. It's kind of like, if a company complains about some open source project, then obviously there is an interest. Right? And then, take control of it. Do something about it. Because it's so silly that you don't want to invest in what is important for your business. If it happens to be no, then you wouldn't be complaining, right? If you are complaining, that means that it matters, it's important, it's critical for your business. it's completely sane to invest in what's important for your business. Nobody would argue about that outside software, right? That reasoning, that discrepancy in that reasoning probably exists only in software, only in open source, nowhere else. Having electricity in my building is very important for my business, and I'm going to, if just it stops working, I'm going to scream, open a window and scream and complain to the God Almighty, right? No, you need to do something about it. You need to fix it.
You are using the word invest. You've got to talk to the business in the terms they understand. They don't understand software, most of them, but they do understand return on investment. So if I'm if I'm putting money towards something as a business that is critical to my business running, I expect a return on investment. That is not, to me, venture capital money, right? You can say VC is investment. It is. But what I'm saying here is I am investing this money. We'll use your power example. I am paying my bill so I continue to get power at the office. If I stop paying the bill to get power at the office and it gets shut off, I can't yell and scream. I chose to not pay the bill.
Exactly. It's as easy as that. Same thing. Just if we get confused. Oh, it's open source, right? It will automatically be fixed. No, it won't.
All you have to do is take a look at the backlog of issues for any open source project that's been around for years and see how many of the issues have never even been touched and they've been open for 8, 9, 10 years. It's what happens because you have humans working on an open source project. Some are funded, some are not. Let's go at it a little bit differently. We've been talking about larger projects.
Most of them are funded.
Most of them are funded. Yes, are funded. But let's talk about the ones that aren't. Let's talk about the 1 and 2 person working on a project. Let's think Log4j for just a second, right? You've seen the meme cartoon to where it's the stack of bricks, but it's just the little guy in Nebraska that's maintaining Log4j.
Exactly.
What do you do there? I mean, we know how SQLite does it. The company behind SQLite, there's 3 people that work on SQLite. 3. Probably the most used database in the universe. 3 people work on it. But how do they keep working on it? People pay support contracts.
Yeah, but that's also, to be honest, that's the nature of open source. Let's say Log4j, for example, right? You could say, I'm using it. I'm not investing in it. I'm a freeloader. That vulnerability kicked in. That was a disaster. I'm going to wait it out because somebody else is going to kick in and solve it one way or another. You can continue being freeloader. Just please don't yell on Twitter or whatever, oh, I shouldn't be using open source. Because that's the case. You shouldn't. You shouldn't. You specifically shouldn't.
So what do you think about this? We've gone all over the place about open source. We talked about license changes. We've talked about companies changing how they ship the software. What do you think? Head over to the Slack workspace, go over to the podcast channel and look for episode number 264 and leave your comments there.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.